Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission here is pretty simple. We take complex topics, look at all the source material, and basically give you the core knowledge, that 80-20 takeaway, so you can quickly get past the noise and, get straight to the real insights.
And today, we are definitely undertaking a massive deep dive, American politics.
Yeah.
Now, we're not here to argue policy or pick sides.
Yeah, it's definitely not.
Our goal is to understand the core structures, the deep historical roots, and those tensions that just keep coming up, defining the U.S. political system.
Yeah.
We're looking at everything from the founding documents right up to today's very polarized environment.
Yeah, and our sources really give us a comprehensive view. We've got the constitutional blueprint, but also let's say, the messy reality of over 2 centuries of conflict and change. We're really aiming for that deep understanding you need to make sense of current events.
Exactly. And the big question, the one that sort of frames every major debate in this country, honestly, from 1787 right up to this minute, is fundamental. Who gets what, when, and how? We're exploring how power and resources are distributed and how that contest, that constant push and pull, has shaped the American Republic through, well, every single crisis and every era.
Okay, let's dive in. Let's start unpacking this with the foundational stuff, the sort of operating system, the structures that really dictate the how and the where of power. And I think we need to start by just defining politics itself.
Yeah, working definition is absolutely critical. So politics, at its simplest, is the process we use for making collective decisions. Decisions about what? About the distribution of power and resources in society.
Okay.
Now, government is obviously central to this. It's the formal machinery. But politics is driven just as much by citizens, by organized interest groups, the media, social movements.
Yeah.
It really is at its heart about that contest over who gets what, when, and how.
And in the U.S. context, the first big layer of complexity you immediately hit is federalism. That's the where of power, right? I think for a lot of people, understanding American politics really hinges on knowing which level of government actually has the authority to do something.
Absolutely. Federalism, this formal sharing of power between the national government and the state governments, it's core to the American structure. It's often misunderstood. People think it's inefficient, but it's actually deliberately designed to prevent power from getting too concentrated in one place.
Okay.
So the federal national government, it handles the issues that really demand a unified national approach. Defense, foreign policy, printing money, and, crucially, regulating trade between the states, interstate commerce.
But then you have the state level, which frankly impacts most of us much more frequently day to day. States manage core services like, education standards, local policing protocols, the nitty-gritty of how elections are run, and most local infrastructure planning.
And then even below that, you've got local government, cities, counties, townships. They're dealing with super granular stuff. Zoning laws, who picks up the trash, utility provision, neighborhood police, and fire services. Think about the difference between a big national debate on healthcare versus whether your local council approves, say, a new apartment building down the street.
Yeah, that contrast really brings it home. And this structure, it gives us our first really powerful takeaway, I think. Federal law sets the big picture, the national framework like, say, minimum air quality standards across the country.
Right.
But your actual day-to-day quality of life, the cost of getting a business license, how good your local schools are, traffic enforcement, that's shaped far more significantly by your state and local governments. That's where so many policy battles are actually won or lost.
And just to add a bit more nuance there for our listeners, federal power isn't just about passing laws. It's often projected through what we call intergovernmental relations.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, the national government frequently uses money financial mandates or incentives to influence state policy. For instance, the federal government might tie highway funding to states adopting a certain drinking age or maybe specific environmental regulations.
Ah, so the states need the money, so they adopt the policy.
Exactly. It means states often end up implementing federal policy, which makes that neat division of power you see in the Constitution look, well, a lot blurrier in practice than it seems on paper.
That friction, that blurriness, it leads us right into the separation of powers, the how power is wielded. The Constitution's really big idea wasn't just giving government power, but splitting it up among 3 distinct branches and kind of deliberately setting them up to clash.
Yes.
This system of checks and balances, it's almost designed to be inefficient, isn't it?
That inefficiency is precisely the point. It's the intentional mechanism designed to prevent tyranny, to stop any one part from dominating. So you've got the legislative branch, that's Congress, split into the House and the Senate. Their job is making the laws and, crucially, controlling the money, the national purse. It's designed to be representative and, yeah, often pretty chaotic.
Then you have the executive branch. That's the president, the cabinet, and this huge network of federal agencies. Their job is to enforce, administer, and, execute the laws passed by Congress. And that branch has grown massively since the founding. It's way more than just an administrator now.
Absolutely. And finally, you have the judicial branch, the Supreme Court at the top, and all the lower federal courts. Their role is interpreting the laws, making sure they line up with the Constitution. So the friction we see all the time, the gridlock, the frustrating slowness, that's not necessarily a bug. It's actually, in many ways, a core feature of the system.
A feature, not a bug.
It's designed to force compromise, to force consensus across these different bodies that represent different constituencies.
Okay, so we've got the structures, federalism, separation of powers. But what about the rule book? What are the foundational documents that actually set this whole game in motion?
Right. It really starts with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But it's important to remember this is not a governing document. It doesn't set up structures.
It's more philosophical.
Exactly. It's a political argument, a justification for revolution. It lays out that philosophy of natural rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and makes the case, based on those principles, for why the colonies were right to break away from King George III.
Okay, so the actual blueprint comes later with the Constitution in 1787. This is the document that establishes the permanent structure, the framework for federalism, separation of powers, how elections work. It defines what the government is and how it's supposed to operate.
And then the absolutely necessary addition, the Bill of Rights, which was added in 1791. If the Constitution created the government, the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments, set the hard limits on that government.
Protecting individual freedoms.
Precisely. Freedom of speech, religion, the press, assembly, due process rights. It ensures the federal government couldn't just become the new tyrant they'd fought a war to get rid of.
So the really crucial takeaway here for anyone trying to understand the system is that these two documents, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, they are the fundamental rules of the game. Every policy debate, every court case, every challenge to government authority ultimately refers back to them.
Right. So if those structures are kind of the hardware of the system, then the big ongoing debate about the size and role of government, that's like the software that's perpetually needing an update. This is the enduring ideological fault line, really, that underpins almost all modern American political conflict.
And that debate consistently seems to boil down to the what, right?
Yep.
How much should the government actually do? How much should it intervene in the economy, in social life, versus what should be left strictly to the private sector or local communities or just individual choice?
Exactly. And we can sort of sketch out the two general perspectives, keeping in mind these are broad strokes. The Democrat perspective, generally speaking, tends to view government intervention as necessary and often beneficial. They'd argue that an active government is essential to, say, promote economic equality, to correct market failures when the free market doesn't produce good outcomes, to regulate corporations to prevent harm or instability, and to provide a robust social safety net. Think programs like the Affordable Care Act, Social Security, federal funding for education. There's generally more trust in the collective power of government to tackle big societal problems like climate change or poverty.
Okay, and the Republican perspective generally?
Generally advocates for a more limited government. The focus tends to be on core functions like national defense, securing borders, and maintaining what they see as genuinely free markets. There's often a default skepticism towards federal regulation with the belief that it stifles innovation and individual liberty.
Right.
The trust is placed more in individuals, private enterprise, and community institutions like churches, charities, local groups, rather than big interventionist federal programs to handle social and economic needs.
But it's crucial to remember, like you said, these aren't monolithic blocks. For instance, Republicans generally favor massive government spending and intervention when it comes to the military and national security.
Absolutely. A huge apparatus.
While Democrats might be more hesitant there. And conversely, Republicans often express deep skepticism about the power of agencies like the IRS or the EPA,
Right.
which Democrats tend to see as essential for fairness or environmental protection. So the debate isn't really about no government versus government.
No, not at all. It's about where that government power should be focused and how much power it should have in specific areas. That's the constant negotiation.
Okay, that clarifies the ideological battle lines. Now let's look at the actual power dynamics in play. Government power versus citizen power. Government power seems pretty tangible. It's the ability to make laws, enforce them, regulate industries, collect taxes, use military force, shape social policy.
Yeah, it's formal institutional power. Citizen power, on the other hand, is our right, our ability to influence those formal structures. And we have tools. Voting is the most fundamental one.
The bedrock.
Exactly. Then there's organizing collective action, like protests, demonstrations. The civil rights movement is a key example. There's direct lobbying of officials, petitioning the government, and critically running for and holding office ourselves. The whole system is theoretically built on the idea that the people, the citizens, can and must influence the state.
But, and this feels like a really important but, that influence isn't evenly distributed, is it? It seems like a challenging, practical truth about American politics that while the legal right to influence might be universal, the actual ability to influence is, well, significantly amplified for certain groups.
Precisely. That's a crucial point. Power is amplified, sometimes exponentially, for those with significant financial wealth, or those who control large media platforms that can get messages out instantly to millions.
Or highly organized groups.
Yes, or extremely high levels of organization. Think about powerful industry lobbies, major labor unions, or advocacy movements with national infrastructure and funding. The individual voice matters, absolutely, but organized, well-financed groups can multiply that voice far, far beyond the impact of a single vote.
And if you want a quick way to gauge the collective strength of citizen power at any given moment, you just need to look at voter turnout statistics, right?
It's a very strong indicator. When turnout is low, the influence of money and organized special interests tends to expand to fill that vacuum. The system inevitably becomes less representative of the broader population when fewer people participate.
Okay, so to really grasp today's tensions, we absolutely have to dig into the history. American politics didn't just spring into existence fully formed. It started way back with the conflicts that defined the colonial period, roughly 1607 to 1776 under the British Empire.
Right. And it's easy to focus only on the oppression leading up to the revolution, but we should acknowledge the colonists enjoyed some real benefits from British rule for over a century.
Like what?
Well, they had military protection from the powerful British Navy and Army, shielding them from major European rivals like France and Spain. That was huge. They also had guaranteed access to the vast British global market for their exports, tobacco, timber, etc. Plus, they inherited the stability of English common law and, importantly, a strong tradition of local assemblies that granted them a fair amount of self-rule on local matters.
Okay, so there were upsides. But obviously the cons eventually outweighed the pros.
Steadily, yes. The colonists really chafed under the limitations on their autonomy. London, Parliament, and the King always had the power to veto colonial laws. They faced harsh economic restrictions like the Navigation Acts, which basically forced them to ship goods only on British ships and often through England first, which stifled their ability to trade freely and grow commercially.
And then the big one, the breaking point, was really about authority, specifically taxation without representation.
That was the trigger. After the very expensive French and Indian War, which Britain fought partly to protect the colonies, London decided the colonies needed to chip in and pay their share of the war debt.
Makes sense from London's perspective.
Absolutely. But the colonists argued, quite forcefully, that being taxed by a parliament where they had no elected representatives was fundamentally unjust. It made them subject to arbitrary authority, kind of like the royal governors appointed by the king, who often acted with a heavy hand.
So the core tension was really structural, wasn't it? The colonists kind of wanted the benefits of being in the empire, the protection, the markets, but without the political limits or the financial costs that came with it.
That's a great way to put it. And this tension just escalated dramatically. You see it in the protests against the Stamp Act. The Sugar Act, no taxation without representation, becomes the rallying cry. Then it radicalizes with incidents like the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and that path leads pretty directly to the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775, and then the Declaration of Independence a year later.
Okay, so fast forward past the Revolutionary War. We get to the early Republic, roughly 1789 to 1824. This was a period of incredibly fragile institution building, right? They were trying to create a government with basically no historical precedent, no king, no aristocracy, just this written constitution, and honestly, a pretty weak sense of national identity at first.
Extremely fragile.
Yeah.
And this era introduced some absolutely defining institutional structures and norms. The Bill of Rights, as we mentioned, was added almost immediately in 1791, which was crucial for getting the Constitution ratified in some states.
Right.
George Washington, voluntarily stepping down after 2 terms, set this incredibly important anti-monarchical precedent. But maybe the most significant development, for the future balance of power anyway, was the Supreme Court asserting its authority in the case of Marbury v. Madison in 1803.
Ah, yes, judicial review. Many people know the outcome, but the politics behind that decision were fascinating. Chief Justice John Marshall was kind of stuck, wasn't he?
He was in a political vice. If he ordered the Jefferson administration to deliver Marbury's commission, Jefferson likely would have just ignored the court, which would have completely undermined the court's authority right at the beginning.
Making the court look powerless.
Exactly. But if he just backed down entirely, the court also looks weak. Marshall's solution was brilliant, really.
What did he do?
He ruled that the specific part of the law Marbury was using to bring his case directly to the Supreme Court was itself unconstitutional. So by doing that, he simultaneously asserted the court's power to interpret the Constitution and strike down acts of Congress, that's judicial review, without actually having to force a direct confrontation with President Jefferson that the court almost certainly would have lost at that moment.
Wow. So he claimed the maximum power for the court by strategically refusing to exercise it in that specific instance.
Precisely. It was a masterclass in institutional maneuvering.
Okay. And during this early period, we also saw the first real political fault lines appear with the first-party system.
Yes. The Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, versus the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison.
And they had very different visions.
Completely different. The Federalists championed a strong national government, promoting industry, establishing a national bank to stabilize the nation's credit, and generally favoring closer ties with Britain. They were fundamentally right about the need for central stability and sound financial organization for the new nation to survive.
Whereas Jefferson and Madison's Democratic Republicans were deeply suspicious of centralized power.
Very suspicious. They advocated for states' rights, a strictly limited federal government, an economy based on agriculture, and were generally more sympathetic to revolutionary France. And they were fundamentally right about the need to safeguard individual liberty and resist the potential for a new kind of centralized aristocracy or oligarchy to emerge.
It's that tension again.
It is, that ongoing creative tension between those two poles, central stability versus states' rights and individual liberty, is arguably what gave the early republic its dynamism and eventually its resilience.
And we should also mention the Revolution of 1800, that election where Jefferson defeated the incumbent Federalist President John Adams.
Hugely important. It marked the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties in American history. That set a crucial democratic norm that, frankly, we often take for granted today, but it was revolutionary at the time.
Absolutely. But even with these successes, we have to acknowledge the deep structural failures of this era, too.
Oh, absolutely. Slavery wasn't resolved. In fact, it was further entrenched in the Constitution through compromises like the Three-Fifths Clause. Voting rights were still incredibly restricted, generally only for white male property owners, which excluded the vast majority of the population.
And Native Americans.
Systematically pushed aside, dispossessed of their lands through treaties that were often broken, and military force as the country aggressively expanded westward. These were not small issues. They were ticking time bombs embedded in the foundation of the Republic.
Which leads us right into the next era, Jacksonian democracy, roughly 1825 to 1849. This period is really defined by a kind of populism and massive geographic expansion, isn't it?
Yes, and the definition of democracy itself expanded significantly, though, critically, only for white men. Property requirements for voting were largely eliminated, leading to near-universal white male suffrage. This ushered in the era of the common man in politics, moving away from the elite-dominated politics of the founding generation.
And Andrew Jackson himself was a really transformative and also controversial figure.
Hugely transformative. He significantly strengthened the power of the presidency. He saw himself as the direct representative of the common people, challenging institutions he viewed as serving only the elites, most famously by vetoing the recharter of the Second National Bank.
Right, the bank war.
Exactly. He also made extensive use of the spoils system, giving government jobs to loyal political supporters, which really institutionalized partisanship in the federal bureaucracy. But this expansion of democracy for white men came at an enormous moral cost, most notably the devastating Indian Removal Act of 1830.
The Trail of Tears.
Which led directly to the forced, brutal migration of several Native American nations from their ancestral homelands in the Southeast to territories west of the Mississippi. A profound tragedy.
And the political conflicts of this era sort of formalized into the second-party system.
Right. You had Jackson's Democrats, who were generally populist, deeply suspicious of concentrated wealth and banking power, strongly favored westward expansion, and became increasingly unified, especially in the South, in their defense of slavery as integral to their way of life.
And who opposed them?
They were opposed by the Whig Party, led by figures like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. The Whigs generally favored a stronger Congress relative to the presidency. They supported federal investment in infrastructure, roads, canals, what they call internal improvements, to promote economic modernization. They generally had a more commercial, industrial vision for the country's future compared to the agrarian focus of the Democrats.
But the core tension from the early republic, that fight over federal versus state power, it didn't go away. It just got deeper, right? It started morphing into dangerous sectionalism.
It absolutely deepened. Disputes over slavery's expansion, over trade tariffs that benefited northern industry but hurt southern agriculture, and over the fundamental question of states' rights versus federal authority became much sharper and more existential. The perfect illustration of this is the nullification crisis of 1832.
Tell us about that. What happened?
This was pivotal. South Carolina, furious about high federal tariffs, they felt unfairly targeted their economy, asserted the doctrine of nullification. They claimed that an individual state had the sovereign right to reject or nullify a federal law it deemed unconstitutional within its own borders.
A direct challenge to federal supremacy.
A direct challenge. President Jackson responded forcefully, calling nullification treasonous and threatening to use military force to enforce the federal tariff law in South Carolina. He famously declared that the Union was perpetual and could not be dissolved by a single state.
So how was it resolved?
Eventually, a compromise tariff was negotiated by Henry Clay, and South Carolina backed down. But the episode laid bare the terrifying reality. The fundamental question of whether ultimate sovereignty resided with the states or the federal government was still dangerously unresolved. It was a direct foreshadowing of the conflict that would eventually tear the nation apart.
Okay, so by the 1850s, it feels like the political system was just completely overwhelmed by one single uncontainable issue: slavery. Every time the U.S. acquired new territory, Texas, California, the lands from the Mexican-American War, the central agonizing question erupted: would slavery be allowed to expand there?
Yes, the system, designed for compromise on economic issues, simply couldn't handle the moral and existential weight of the slavery question. And the attempts at legislative compromise during this decade just became increasingly inflammatory, actually worsening the divisions.
Like the Compromise of 1850.
Exactly. It was meant to be a grand bargain to settle the issue, admitting California as a free state, but also including the incredibly controversial Fugitive Slave Act.
What did that do?
It required citizens in free states and federal officials to actively assist in capturing and returning escaped slaves. This effectively nationalized the institution of slavery, forcing Northerners to participate in it, which sparked massive outrage and resistance in the North. It made compromise much harder.
And that didn't even hold the line for long.
Not at all. Just 4 years later, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 blew things wide open again. It introduced the idea of popular sovereignty.
Letting the settlers decide.
Letting the settlers in new territories vote for themselves whether to allow slavery. The intention might have been democratic, but the immediate result was violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, both sides trying to control the vote, leading to years of brutal guerrilla warfare known as Bleeding Kansas.
So political compromise was failing, violence was erupting. Then came the Supreme Court's intervention.
Yes, the judicial crisis sparked by the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision in 1857. The court, perhaps hoping to settle the slavery question definitively through law, instead made any political compromise virtually impossible.
What did the ruling actually say?
Chief Justice Roger Taney delivered the majority opinion, which made two devastating claims. First, that black people, whether enslaved or free, were not and could never be considered citizens of the United States under the Constitution. And second, that Congress had no constitutional power to prohibit slavery in any U.S. territory. This effectively declared the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had banned slavery north of a certain line, unconstitutional.
So the court basically ruled that slavery had constitutional protection to expand anywhere in the territories.
That was the implication. It invalidated the main policy tool anti-slavery forces had relied on for decades, congressional limitation. The ruling absolutely inflamed the North, who saw the Supreme Court as actively protecting and promoting the expansion of slavery, becoming an arm of the Southern slave power. The political ground just completely fractured after that.
And this led to the collapse of the existing party system.
Completely. The Whig Party, which had tried to bridge the North-South divide, disintegrated over the slavery issue. In its place, rising rapidly in the North, was the new Republican Party, founded explicitly on the platform of preventing the expansion of slavery into the territories. It drew support from former Northern Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, abolitionists, and farmers.
And the election of Republican Abraham Lincoln in 1860.
Even though Lincoln initially pledged only to stop slavery's expansion, not to interfere with it where it already existed, his election was seen by the Southern slaveholding states as an existential threat to their way of life and their entire economic and social system. That triggered the secession of Southern states, the formation of the Confederacy, and ultimately the Civil War, the complete collapse of the constitutional system established in 1787.
The profound historical lesson from this whole antebellum era seems crystal clear looking back.
It really is. Deep moral contradictions, especially those touching on fundamental human rights and dignity, cannot be papered over indefinitely by political deals and compromises. The system, designed for managing conflict through friction and negotiation, eventually just shattered under the immense weight of that unresolved moral failure.
Okay, so after the incredibly devastating Civil War, the country enters the period of Reconstruction, and alongside it, rapid industrialization, roughly 1865 to 1900. The immediate, absolutely colossal tasks were, 1, putting the Union back together, and 2, figuring out what freedom actually meant for the 4 million formerly enslaved people.
Two monumental challenges. And Reconstruction, at least initially, delivered a massive, almost unbelievable leap forward in American constitutional law with the Reconstruction Amendments.
Right, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment.
Exactly. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, formally abolished slavery and involuntary servitude across the entire nation. The 14th Amendment in 1868 is arguably one of the most important. It defined birthright citizenship. Anyone born in the U.S. is a citizen, and crucially guaranteed all citizens equal protection of the laws and due process of law, applying these protections against the states for the first time.
A truly radical shift in the federal-state balance.
A radical and foundational concept. And then the 15th Amendment in 1870 prohibited denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, effectively granting suffrage to black men, at least in theory.
In theory being the key phrase there, because the progress was almost immediately undermined, wasn't it?
Tragically, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It was undermined by the failure of enforcement. The political will in the North began to wane, facing violent resistance in the South and shifting priorities. The final nail in the coffin was the contested presidential election of 1876, which led to the Compromise of 1877.
What was that compromise?
Essentially, the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, was awarded the presidency in exchange for agreeing to withdraw the remaining federal troops from the South. That withdrawal formally ended Reconstruction, and without federal protection, the rights guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendments were rapidly stripped away from black Southerners.
Ushering in the Jim Crow era.
Exactly. A long period of legal segregation, systematic disenfranchisement through poll taxes and literacy tests, intimidation, and widespread racial violence, designed to reestablish white supremacy.
And happening at the exact same time as this moral abandonment was the Gilded Age, this era of just explosive industrial growth.
Yes, railroads spanning the continent, massive growth in steel, oil, finance. High tariffs protected northern industries, creating unimaginable wealth for a very small number of industrialists. The figure is often called robber barons, like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt.
But this growth created huge problems, too.
Staggering inequality. You had this immense wealth alongside extreme poverty, dangerous working conditions in factories and mines, and intense class tensions. This period also saw widespread political corruption, perfectly epitomized by urban political machines like Tammany Hall in New York City, where politicians openly traded government favors and graft for votes and power.
And this instability, this inequality fueled resistance.
It fueled the rise of the labor movement, which fought, often through violent strikes and confrontations, for basic rights like better wages, shorter hours, and safer workplaces.
So, pulling back from this whole period, 1865 to 1900, what's the big takeaway, the painful lesson, especially from the failure of Reconstruction?
I think the crucial lesson, the one that echoes throughout American history, is that laws on paper, even constitutional amendments, are never sufficient on their own. Without sustained political will, without robust enforcement by the executive branch, and without commitment from the judiciary, even fundamental rights can be rendered almost entirely meaningless in practice. Rights require constant defense.
Okay, so the chaos, the corruption, the stark inequality of the Gilded Age, that eventually created a powerful backlash, didn't it? A demand for change.
It absolutely did. And that demand fueled the progressive era, which really took off around 1900 and lasted through about 1920. This was a broad, multifaceted movement aimed directly at regulating the excesses of capitalism, increasing corporate accountability, cleaning up government, and making democracy itself more responsive to the people.
And we saw some really significant domestic reforms during this time.
Huge reforms. You had President Theodore Roosevelt famously championing his square deal. He used the Sherman Antitrust Act much more aggressively than his predecessors to actually break up huge corporate monopolies, like the Northern Securities Railroad Trust.
And wasn't there a role for journalists, too?
A massive role.
Yeah.
Investigative journalists, who Roosevelt actually dubbed the muckrakers, people like Ida Tarbell, who exposed the ruthless practices of Standard Oil, or Upton Sinclair, whose novel The Jungle depicted the horrific conditions in the meatpacking industry. They created enormous public pressure for change.
Leading to actual legislation.
Yes, leading directly to landmark consumer protection laws like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. The public demanded action once they knew what was happening.
And democracy itself was expanded structurally during this period.
Significantly.
Yeah.
The 17th Amendment was ratified, providing for the direct election of U.S. senators by the people rather than by state legislatures, which were often controlled by party bosses and special interests.
Making the Senate more accountable.
Exactly.
Right.
And many states, particularly out west, adopted tools of direct democracy, like initiatives where citizens could propose laws themselves, and referendums where citizens could vote directly on laws passed by the legislature and recall elections. And, of course, the long fight for women's suffrage finally culminated in the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920.
A huge expansion of the electorate. And at the same time all this was happening domestically, the U.S. was also stepping onto the world stage in a much bigger way.
Yes, the turn of the century marked a real shift. Events like the Spanish-American War in 1898, which resulted in the U.S. acquiring territories like Puerto Rico and the Philippines, the construction of the Panama Canal, and eventually America's decisive intervention in World War I, all these expanded the notion of American global power and influence.
And did this affect the presidency?
It dramatically expanded the power and prominence of the presidency. Figures like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson really used the executive office as the primary engine for driving both reform at home and asserting leadership abroad. The bully pulpit, as TR called it.
But there was a significant limitation, a blind spot in a lot of these progressive reforms, wasn't there?
A huge one. Many of these reforms were enacted within a framework that still accepted, and in many ways reinforced, racial segregation and discrimination. The Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, which upheld separate but equal, was still the law of the land. So, while many political gains were made, they often functionally excluded or were actively denied to Black Americans, particularly in the South. Progress was definitely uneven.
Okay, so this reformed, more powerful, more globally engaged political system then slams headfirst into the greatest economic challenge in its history. That brings us to the era of the Great Depression, the New Deal, and World War II, basically the 1920s through the 1940s.
Right. And the 1920s provide crucial backdrop. It was a decade largely dominated by pro-business, relatively isolationist Republican presidents. Culturally, it was complex, marked by prohibition, the nationwide ban on alcohol via the 18th Amendment, and also by severe nativist restrictions on immigration.
Kind of a contradictory decade, roaring 20s, but also deep anxieties.
Very much so. Then, bam, the stock market crash of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression. The crisis was catastrophic. It completely exposed the failures and limitations of the largely unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism of the 1920s. Unemployment skyrocketed, eventually hitting around 25%. Banks failed in waves. Public confidence in the entire financial and political system just collapsed. It was an existential threat.
And the response was Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. This feels like another one of those moments that permanently changed the trajectory.
Absolutely fundamental. The New Deal permanently altered the American social contract. It fundamentally redefined the role of the federal government. Instead of just being seen as a protector of basic liberty and property rights, the government became accepted as an active manager of the economy and a direct provider of social welfare and security.
What were some of the key programs?
The list is long, But the most enduring pillars include Social Security, creating that federal system for retirement and disability insurance. Unemployment insurance provided a safety net for jobless workers. And extensive federal regulation of the banking system, through bodies like the FDIC insuring deposits, aimed to prevent future collapses.
So this established the idea that the federal government has a responsibility for economic security.
Yes, it established the lasting precedent that the federal government is responsible for providing at least a basic floor of economic security for its citizens. This effectively ended the dominance of the 19th century small government ideology, though debates about the extent of that responsibility continue fiercely to this day.
Now, the New Deal helped stabilize things, but it didn't fully end the Depression, did it?
No, not entirely. It was really the massive government spending and industrial mobilization required for World War II that finally pulled the U.S. economy completely out of the Depression.
And the war itself had a huge global impact.
Transformative. The U.S. emerged from World War II as the undisputed leading global superpower. It played the central role in shaping the post-war international order through institutions like the United Nations and the Bretton Woods agreements, which established the framework for international finance and trade, cementing America's new dominant role on the world stage.
So the big lesson from the New Deal and the war years.
The government's role expanded irreversibly. It shifted from just maintaining order and enforcing contracts to proactively managing economic cycles and providing social insurance. This fundamentally changed the expectations citizens have held for their political system ever since.
And that expanded role, that sense of global responsibility, carried right into the next period, the post-war and Cold War era, roughly the 1950s through the 1970s.
Exactly. Abroad, the defining feature was the Cold War, this intense, decades-long ideological rivalry with the Soviet Union. U.S. foreign policy became dominated by the strategy of containment, trying to prevent the spread of communism through military alliances like NATO, a massive nuclear arms race, and involvement in proxy wars around the globe, most notably in Korea and later, disastrously, in Vietnam.
But while that global struggle was happening, there was an equally profound struggle happening at home.
Yes, simultaneously, this era witnessed the peak of the Civil Rights Revolution. Fueled by decades of organizing, strategy, and incredible courage, particularly through nonviolent direct action movements led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., it achieved truly historic breakthroughs against legal segregation and disenfranchisement.
Key milestones being
The Supreme Court's landmark ruling in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which declared state-sponsored segregation in public schools unconstitutional, overturning Plessy v. Ferguson. And then Congress, spurred by the movement, passed the crucial Civil Rights Act of 1964, outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public accommodations and employment, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which finally provided strong federal enforcement mechanisms to protect black voting rights in the South.
These acts finally started putting real enforcement behind the promises of the Reconstruction amendments from a century earlier.
Exactly. It was a second Reconstruction, in a sense, finally giving teeth to those constitutional guarantees.
And domestically, government expansion continued in other areas, too.
Oh, yes, quite aggressively, particularly under President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society initiatives in the mid-60s. This period saw the creation of Medicare, providing health insurance for the elderly, and Medicaid, providing health coverage for low-income individuals and families, as well as major federal investments aimed at fighting the war on poverty. A massive expansion of the social safety net.
But this era of progress and expansion didn't end on a high note, did it? The late 60s and 70s saw a real downturn.
A significant downturn. Trust in government and major institutions began to erode dramatically. The Vietnam War dragged on, becoming deeply unpopular and divisive, seen by many as an unwinnable and immoral quagmire. The assassinations of key leaders, President Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy, deeply shook the nation's sense of stability and optimism.
And then Watergate.
And then the Watergate scandal unfolded, exposing profound corruption, illegality, and abuse of power at the very highest level of government, leading to President Nixon's resignation and disgrace. All of this combined, Vietnam, assassinations, Watergate, created a deep well of public cynicism and disillusionment with government, paving the intellectual and political ground for the next major ideological shift in American politics.
Okay, so that widespread cynicism and desire for change set the stage for the late 1970s and 1980s, which marked another really sharp ideological turn. The Reagan Revolution.
Yes, this was a decisive challenge to the post-New Deal, post-Great Society consensus that had largely favored government intervention and expansion. Ronald Reagan rode a wave of conservative sentiment into office.
And Reaganomics became the defining policy approach. What did that involve?
At its core was supply-side economic theory. This translated into significant tax cuts, especially for corporations and higher income earners, based on the idea that this would stimulate investment and economic growth that would trickle down. It also involves substantial deregulation across key industries like finance and transportation, and simultaneously a massive buildup of the military aimed squarely at confronting and outspending the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It was a very concerted effort to shrink the scope and influence of the federal government in domestic affairs while dramatically increasing it in defense.
And the global situation shifted dramatically right around the end of this period.
Hugely. Between 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and 1991, with the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Cold War abruptly ended. The U.S. was suddenly left as the world's sole superpower. This led to a brief period, often called a unipolar moment, of unprecedented American global influence and dominance.
How did politics adapt to that new reality in the 90s? We got the Clinton era.
Right. The Clinton presidency saw the rise of what became known as third-way politics. This was essentially Democrats adapting to and largely accepting the new fiscal and ideological landscape shaped by Reagan.
So, more moderate.
Generally more moderate, yes. Clinton and the New Democrats pursued policies like balancing the federal budget, further deregulation in some areas like telecommunications and finance, and enthusiastically embracing economic globalization through trade agreements like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
But even with economic prosperity in the 90s, the political climate didn't exactly become harmonious, did it?
Not at all. Partisan bitterness actually deepened significantly during the Clinton years, fueled by cultural clashes and culminating famously in the highly polarizing impeachment proceedings against President Clinton. The seeds of our current hyper-partisanship were definitely being sown then.
Okay, looking back at that whole Reagan-Clinton era, that consensus around lower taxes, deregulation, globalization, what were the critical long-term consequences?
Well, economically, while the overall economy did grow, the combination of Reagan's tax policies and the effects of globalization, particularly the loss of manufacturing jobs to overseas competition, led to a significant widening of income inequality in the U.S.
Which created resentment.
It created long-term economic anxiety and deep cultural resentment in many communities, particularly in the industrial Midwest, that felt left behind by these economic shifts. And those feelings, that sense of being forgotten or displaced, absolutely sowed the seeds for the populist backlash that would erupt later in the 21st century.
Which brings us to the 2000s, an era that was almost instantly redefined by security concerns, another major recession, and the arrival of what feels like hyperpolarization.
Absolutely. The September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001 permanently reshaped American politics, making national security the dominant lens through which almost everything was viewed for years. Domestically, this led to things like the Patriot Act, which dramatically expanded federal surveillance powers.
And abroad.
Abroad, it led to the prolonged wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which consumed the nation's attention, resources, and political debate for the better part of the next 2 decades.
Then came the Obama era, which started right in the teeth of another major crisis.
Yes, the Great Recession of 2008-2009. Much of Obama's first term was focused on economic recovery, implementing major stimulus packages to prevent a deeper collapse, and passing his signature legislative achievement, the Affordable Care Act, ACA, or Obamacare, which significantly expanded health insurance coverage.
But that expansion of government power, particularly the ACA, triggered a massive backlash, didn't it?
Dramatic conservative backlash, primarily coalescing in the Tea Party movement. This movement emphasized fiscal conservatism, limited government, and opposition to the ACA. It fueled increased partisan obstructionism in Congress, making legislative compromise incredibly difficult and contributing to rising gridlock.
And that polarization just seemed to intensify, reaching perhaps new heights during the Trump presidency.
The Trump era really represented a sharp nationalist and populist turn. The rhetoric focused on America first, prioritizing domestic concerns over international agreements, pushing for further deregulation, and making conservative judicial appointments, especially to the Supreme Court, a top priority.
And polarization felt like it shifted from policy disagreements to something deeper.
It really sharpened significantly, driven less by traditional debates over tax rates or spending levels, and much more by deeply entrenched conflicts over national identity, culture, and values. You saw this play out in multiple impeachment proceedings, intense disputes over election integrity.
And the role of information itself seemed to change dramatically.
Critically so. Social media became absolutely central to political discourse. This created phenomena like filter bubbles and echo chambers, where people primarily receive information reinforcing their existing beliefs, and it largely bypassed traditional media gatekeepers.
Making misinformation easier to spread.
Much easier. Information and deliberate disinformation could achieve instantaneous national reach, leading to a kind of systematic erosion of shared facts and growing distrust in institutions like the electoral process itself, the mainstream press, even scientific consensus.
So where does that leave us now, in the current Biden era?
Well, the Biden administration continues to operate amidst this environment of intense, perhaps unprecedented polarization. The focus has been on economic recovery, major investments in infrastructure, addressing climate change, while also managing renewed great power competition with rivals like China and Russia.
But the core condition seems unchanged.
The critical assessment of the current state, based on our sources, is that American politics is now defined less by nuanced policy debate between two broadly accepted frameworks and more by clashes between fundamentally opposing partisan identities and worldviews. The U.S. remains incredibly powerful globally, but it's severely fractured internally. And those foundational democratic norms, like the peaceful acceptance of election results, respect for institutional processes, feel like they are under persistent, serious stress.
Okay, so after tracing this long, often turbulent history, we can start to pull back and see some recurring patterns, maybe even some laws of motion that seem to govern American political life. What's the first really constant dynamic we observe?
The most obvious one is the pendulum swing. American politics seems to constantly cycle back and forth. You get periods of expanding government power and expanding rights. Think of the Progressive Era, the New Deal, the Civil Rights
Yes,
Movement.
change.
Exactly, bursts of significant change. But these are almost always followed by periods of reaction, limitation, or retrenchment, where those expansions are challenged or rolled back. Think of the end of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow, or the Reagan conservative movement responding to the 60s and 70s. Progress is clearly not linear. It often seems to require a major crisis to push the pendulum forward, and then there's an almost inevitable pushback.
Okay, pendulum swing. What's the second constant law?
It's the enduring tension. That fundamental fault line we talked about earlier remains exactly where the founders essentially drew it: liberty versus order. Or, maybe more accurately today, the ongoing argument about the proper size, scope, and role of government and society in the economy.
From the very beginning.
From Federalists versus Democratic Republicans right through to today's Republicans versus Democrats, that core debate over how much the state should intervene versus how much should be left to individuals or the market, it's just constant. It takes different forms, focuses on different issues, but the underlying tension persists. And the third constant struggle, maybe the most painful and persistent.
Yeah, this one feels central. It's the boundary of belonging. The question of who truly counts as a full member of the American political community, who is seen as fully American with all the rights and protections that entails. This has been a constant, evolving, often brutal struggle throughout U.S. history.
From the original sin of slavery embedded in the founding, through the betrayals of Reconstruction and the long nightmare of Jim Crow, through the hard-won victories of the Civil Rights Movement.
And continuing today.
And continuing today in ongoing debates over immigration, racial justice, voting rights, and identity politics. Defining who is us has always been contested territory.
Okay, using these sort of recurring laws or patterns, can we identify the real peaks and valleys in the American political story? What defines the absolute worst eras?
Looking at the sources, the worst eras seem to be characterized by a toxic combination of three things happening at once. First, significant institutional failure or collapse of legitimacy in core governing structures. Second, a profound moral breach, often related to that boundary belonging question. And third, these are often triggered or massively exacerbated by a major economic or security shock. The clearest example is the antebellum era, where the political system of compromise completely failed over the moral catastrophe of slavery, leading to civil war. Another is the collapse of Reconstruction, which represented an institutional and moral abandonment of the promise of multiracial democracy. And perhaps the Vietnam Watergate era, marked by institutional failure in the executive branch, a moral crisis over the war, and a resulting collapse of public trust.
Okay, so conversely, what defines the best eras, the peaks, when the systems seem to be working better?
The peaks seem marked by the opposite combination. Periods of significant institutional innovation or adaptation, coupled with meaningful gains in inclusion and rights expanding that boundary of belonging, often occurring during a time of broadly shared economic prosperity.
Such as?
Well, the founding itself, despite its deep flaws, was a moment of incredible institutional innovation, establishing an enduring constitutional structure and, crucially, the norm of peaceful power transfer. The progressive era brought major democratic reforms like direct election of senators and women's suffrage, and the post-World War II boom combined widespread economic prosperity with the historic breakthroughs of the civil rights movement.
That historical analysis, those peaks and valleys, brings us right up to the present, the 21st century. And the sources seem to suggest this is a uniquely unresolved era.
That's a key insight, yes. The current moment feels intensely transitional, turbulent, maybe even pre-revolutionary in some ways. Unlike past eras that were clearly defined by a single overriding crisis, like the Civil War or the Great Depression, or by a single defining breakthrough like the New Deal or the Civil Rights Act, we seem to be facing something different.
A multi-crisis reality.
Exactly. We're grappling simultaneously with extreme political polarization, the existential threat of climate change, rapid and disruptive technological change, especially AI and social media, economic inequality, and renewed geopolitical competition. This pileup makes the present feel less like a stable, defined phase and more like a prelude, maybe akin to the deeply unsettled 1850s before the Civil War, or the culturally fractured 1920s before the Depression, a time when fundamental questions about the country's direction and the stability of its institutions feel profoundly unresolved.
Okay, so that naturally leads us to speculate, based on these trends, about Stage 10. The next era, looking ahead to 2030 and beyond. What will define the coming decades?
The consensus, from the sources, suggests the future of American politics will be overwhelmingly shaped by how well our democratic system adapts, or fails to adapt, to those massive pressures we just mentioned. The impact of technology like AI on work, society, and truth itself, the unavoidable realities of global climate change, major shifts in global power dynamics, particularly the rise of China, and whether we can overcome, or at least manage, this persistent internal polarization.
So let's game out the possibilities. What's the best case scenario?
The optimistic view is a renewal era. In this scenario, perhaps driven by a generational shift or a shared external threat, polarization begins to ease. Democratic institutions like Congress and the courts regain some functional capacity and public trust. We figure out how to integrate technology responsibly, maybe using AI for public good rather than just disruption. And crucially, the U.S. undertakes serious accelerated climate action at the federal level, maybe forging a new kind of political consensus around environmental and technological adaptation.
Okay, that sounds good. What's the worst case?
The pessimistic view is the fragmentation era. Polarization doesn't just persist, it hardens into permanent dysfunction, maybe even violence. We see a further erosion of democratic norms. Contested elections could become routine. Political trust collapses entirely. Technology, particularly AI, is captured by elites, massively deepening inequality and social division. Climate change impacts worsen, leading to resource conflicts and social unrest. This scenario looks something like a prolonged, technologically advanced Gilded Age, but perhaps without the underlying optimism of that era.
And the middle ground, often the most likely.
A middle ground, perhaps the balancing era. Democracy remains messy, loud, polarized, but ultimately stable enough to function, albeit inefficiently. Reforms happen, but they're incremental, hard-fought compromises, not grand breakthroughs. The U.S. manages its decline from unipolarity, finding a new role in a multipolar world. We grapple with climate change and technology piecemeal, avoiding total collapse, but not achieving transformative solutions either, just kind of muddling through.
And what determines which path we take? What's the hinge factor?
Ultimately, the sources suggest the difference between renewal and fragmentation really comes down to two things. The resilience of our core institutions, those systems of federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances we discussed at the start, and, perhaps even more importantly, the willingness of the public and political leaders to re-engage with the possibility of compromise, to find some common ground, even amidst deep disagreement, especially when facing shared existential challenges like climate change.
Which gives us our final big picture takeaways, the sort of mental models you can use to analyze American politics going forward. First, always apply the federalism lens. When you hear about an issue, immediately ask, is this primarily a federal responsibility, a state one, or a local one? That tells you instantly who actually has the power to act, who is blocking action, and where the real policy battle is likely taking place.
Second takeaway.
Second, always use the separation of powers lens. Expect friction. Remember that gridlock, slowness, and compromise are often features, not bugs, designed to prevent rapid, unchecked shifts in power. And relatedly, understand that durable, lasting political change in the U.S. almost always comes from building broad coalitions and institutionalizing reforms through law and process. It rarely relies solely on the actions of a single, charismatic leader.
And the ultimate question, the one that runs through this entire history.
It remains exactly the same as it was at the founding. How much power should government actually have over what domains, and perhaps most critically, whose voices, whose interests, truly count in that final, ongoing reckoning of who gets what, when, and how?
So to wrap up, American politics really is this constant, often crisis-driven struggle. It's a tug of war between the nation's highest aspirational ideals, liberty, equality, democracy, and the persistent, often harsh realities of exclusion, inequality, and intense partisanship.
Exactly. It advances, it retreats, it adapts, often through these bursts of change followed by periods of consolidation or reaction.
And the 21st century's chapter in that story is still very much being written. Whether this turns out to be an era of democratic renewal or one of political fragmentation really seems to depend on the resilience of those core institutions we've talked about, and maybe even more so on the public's capacity to find some measure of common purpose and compromise in the face of these enormous technological and environmental challenges ahead.
It really is an ongoing, uncertain, high-stakes balancing act. The system was designed perhaps to endure stress, but its survival always depends on the willingness of its citizens to actively participate and keep negotiating the fundamental rules of the game.
A sobering but crucial thought to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.